One of the most valuable skills you can develop is a constant awareness of where the wind is coming from when you are flying so you can correct for it. Since airplanes are affected by the air mass they're flying in, you need to know how to correct for the wind so you can make your airplane go where you want it to go. Picture yourself in a boat on a river, going across a current. Here's the current coming this way. You can't just point at a spot on the opposite bank and expect to go there. Your boat will get carried in this direction. You have to point the bow of the boat slightly upstream into the current so you end up traveling directly across from where you started. Well, wind affects airplanes in flight the same way. If the wind is coming from the side, we call it a crosswind. And just like the boat, you will have to point your airplane into the wind to go on a straight path to your destination. This is called crabbing into the wind. And wind not only affects your path across the ground, it also affects your speed across the ground. Not surprisingly, this is called your ground speed. Downwind, or with the wind, you have the fastest ground speed. In other words, you have a tailwind. Let me give you an example. Here your aircraft speed is 100 knots. This tailwind is 20 knots. So your ground speed would be a net 120 knots. And upwind, or against the wind, your airplane will have the slowest ground speed. In other words, you're flying in a headwind. Again, if your airspeed is 100 knots, but you have a headwind of 20 knots, your net ground speed would be 80 knots. Now, faster and slower ground speeds will make your turns look different over the ground. In this case, we're traveling slower at 80 knots, and your same angle of bank on the slow ground speed will create a radius of a turn that is much tighter. If your speed is higher, or 120 knots, the radius of your turn will be greater. It's just like you're in a car. In the race car on a track, you can make a lot sharper turn if you're going slower. So you have to correct for this change in ground speed and wind direction if you want to keep your path over the ground consistent. Let's look at some maneuvers called ground reference maneuvers that will help you develop your skills at correcting for the wind. The first one is really something you've done before when you came into land. It's called a rectangular course, and it looks just like a traffic pattern. You will use it to correct for the wind and follow a straight path around the airport, staying the same distance away from the runway at all times. Here's the wind coming in this way. That way you'll always be where you're supposed to be in the traffic pattern, and other pilots will know where to look for you. So when you fly a rectangular pattern along the ground, you must adjust for changes in your ground speed and wind drift and maintain a constant airspeed and altitude. Your first leg of the rectangular pattern course is flown downwind. Remember, the wind's coming this way. And as you make your first turn to the left, you'll have your fastest ground speed because you have a tailwind. That means you'll need the steepest bank starting here so that the turn does not stretch out your curved path away from the field. As you continue in the turn, you decrease to a medium bank because your ground speed is decreasing as the wind is coming around to the side. And when you finish the turn, you'll have to turn more than 90 degrees to crab into the wind. It's coming in this direction because it's over here now. As you make your second turn here, you start with a medium bank because your speed is medium, then use a shallow bank as you turn into the wind because your speed will be decreasing as you turn into the wind. As your speed decreases, the bank becomes shallower. And as you can see, you will turn less than 90 degrees because you are already crabbing into the wind here. As you start the next turn with a headwind, this gives you your slowest ground speed. So again, you start with a shallow bank to keep from being blown closer to the field, and then increase it to a medium bank as your ground speed increases. And again, you will turn less than 90 degrees so that you're crabbing into the wind, which is coming in this direction. Finally, for your last turn, you'll go from a medium bank to the steepest bank as your speed again increases, and you'll make more than a 90-degree turn to keep parallel with your road, because remember, you are crabbing away from the rectangle. Also, while you're doing all this, monitor your altitude and airspeed by looking both inside and outside the cockpit, just like you would in the traffic pattern. Another way to polish your wind correction skills is to fly circles around a point on the ground. There's our reference point right there. You would use this if you needed to look at a windsock at an airport or something else on the ground. These are called turns around a point, and the FAA considers this skill so important that it includes it on your practical test. We'll use the same principles that we learned when we flew the rectangular pattern. See, we just have the circle around a point here inside the rectangular pattern. Except this time we are constantly changing our bank to remain the same distance from our point on the ground. This gives us a constant radius circle. Again, the wind is coming in this direction, so we'll enter downwind as before, so your ground speed is the fastest, and so the first bank is the steepest, but no more than 45 degrees. You'll then use a medium bank as the wind changes to a crosswind and your ground speed decreases, and then turn into a shallow bank here as you begin to go upwind. Here you use a shallow bank and then turning to a medium bank as your ground speed starts to increase while you're going crosswind, and finally a medium bank becoming a steep bank again as the wind is behind you and your ground speed is its fastest. The last ground reference maneuver we'll cover also has a descriptive title, S-turns across a road. We were going to call it supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, but unfortunately that was already taken. Now, if we just cut this circle in half and flip one half over here, we have created S-turns across a road. Once again, we're using basically the same corrections as in the first two maneuvers, but keeping constant radius half circles this time as divided by a reference line on the ground. Again, our wind is coming from this direction. We'll enter downwind with your wings parallel to the road. Use the steepest bank here because your speed is the highest, and the shallowest bank upwind because your speed is lowest. The difference is now we reverse direction each time we cross our reference line and keep our wings parallel to it. But if the wind isn't perpendicular to your reference line, your wings would not be parallel to the line. You would be crabbing into the wind as you cross it, but your line of flight would also be perpendicular still to this reference line. Now again, your ground speed is slowest heading in this direction, so your turn will be shallowest. You'll go to a medium turn, and then steepest again as you turn downwind here and finish on this side. Now, once you master these techniques, you'll be well on your way to making the airplane do what you want it to do and not the other way around.